dozens of diplomats from the country. Is Vladimir Putin taking the high road or just looking forward to negotiating with the Donald Trump administration? Mr. Trump does have an opinion. He just tweeted it. Also, what's the story with all those mysterious Russian compounds here in the U.S.? What goes on behind closed doors, and are there more of them? We'll get some answers. And hundreds of people murdered in a major American city this year. We'll take you to the streets of Chicago, where it's a battle of both bullets and blame. That and more of the day's news coming up this hour. Hello, I'm Greg Jarrett in for Shepard Smith. Russian President Vladimir Putin blasting the Obama administration for slapping sanctions on his country and kicking dozens of diplomats out of the United States. Well, the White House announced those punishments yesterday in retaliation for Russia's meddling in the presidential election. In a statement today, Putin said, quote, "We regard the recent unfriendly steps taken by the outgoing U.S. administration as provocative and aimed at further weakening the Russia-U.S. relationship. This runs contrary to the fundamental interest of both the Russian and American people. Considering the global security responsibilities of Russia and the United States, this is also damaging to international relations as a whole." Putin also said Russia has the right to retaliate, but he would not make trouble for U.S. diplomats in his country. He even said he was inviting all children of American diplomats to holiday parties at the Kremlin. Russia denies interfering with the U.S. election, but all 17 American intelligence agencies have concluded that the Kremlin was indeed behind the hacking of the Democratic Party computers, as well as Hillary Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta. All of this hacking exposed thousands of emails, some containing rather embarrassing information. The heads of the CIA and the FBI reportedly say Russia did it specifically to help Donald Trump win the presidential election. Well, the president-elect has said he disagrees. In fact, he insists President Obama and the Democrats are just trying to take away from his win, and the U.S. should move on. Still, he has agreed to meet with U.S. intelligence leaders next week to learn more. However, he tweeted minutes ago, quote, "Great move on delay by V. Putin. I always knew he was very smart." Trump's senior advisor, Kellyanne Conway, talked to Hannity about a report that President Obama punished Russia during the last weeks of office to get in the way of Trump's policy.
I was really disappointed to read in David Sanger's New York Times piece this evening the allegation or the supposition that perhaps one reason that these sanctions are taking place is to, quote, box in President-elect Trump, forcing him to take a position or otherwise once he takes office. I hope that this isn't motivated by politics even a little bit.
In the meantime, we are keeping a very close eye on two Russian compounds, one in New York, the other Maryland. U.S. officials say the Russians were using them for spying. The State Department is shutting them down today, and the Russian diplomats have just a couple of more days before they have to leave the country. We have Team Fox coverage. Peter Ducey live in Palm Beach, Florida, where President-elect Trump is spending the holidays. But first, let's turn to Caroline Shively at the State Department. Caroline, Putin says he will not kick out U.S. diplomats despite what his advisors recommended. What more do we know?
Sure, Greg, that was actually a surprise from what we heard yesterday. Putin says he is no longer reacting to the Obama administration. His moves are now based on the incoming policies of the Trump administration. Here's more of what Putin had to say in a statement, quote, "Although we have the right to retaliate, we will not resort to irresponsible kitchen diplomacy, but will plan our further steps to restore Russian-U.S. relations based on the policies of the Trump administration." Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev went even further on Twitter. He says, "It is regrettable that the Obama administration, which started out by restoring our ties, is ending its term in an anti-Russian agony. Rest in peace." The Russian embassy to the U.S. said the 35 diplomats and their 61 dependents will go home in style, tweeting this photo of their ride home. This plane is part of a special Russian flight squadron. Sweet ride or not, many aren't happy about it.
But what happened is they have to leave within hours, and it's just not human, frankly, not human.
Their deadline for leaving is Sunday, Greg.
Caroline, the State Department says this is about more than just meddling in the election. How so?
Sure. They say that U.S. personnel over in Russia has been harassed for the last year. Police have pulled them over. They've been physically assaulted, and their personal information has been broadcast on Russian television. Of course, the Russian sanctions, or the sanctions against Russia, won't end with what Mr. Obama is doing. Congress is now getting in on this. Senator Ben Cardin has called for a special hearing on this, special congressional committee to be formed, and Senator John McCain has called for hearings on January 5th. Greg?
Caroline Shively at the State Department. Caroline, thank you. Team Fox coverage continuing now. Peter Ducey is live in Palm Beach, Florida. Peter, we don't know what the president-elect plans to do with these sanctions once he's sworn into office, right?
We don't know yet, Greg. He's keeping his options open. Could keep the sanctions, could get rid of them after he's sworn in. But the incoming White House Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, wants to make one point perfectly clear. He says that the next president has no interest in treating somebody who may have interfered with the American election with kid gloves.
I would also say this, and the president-elect agrees with this. We agree that foreign governments shouldn't be hacking American institutions, period. So it's not like we condone the hacking of institutions and entities and businesses in America. Of course not.
Still, the president-elect thinks it's time to move on and start talking about other stuff. He put out a 2-sentence statement last night that said this: it's time for our country to move on to bigger and better things. Nevertheless, in the interest of our country and its great people, I will meet with leaders of the intelligence community next week in order to be updated on the facts of the situation. So we know he's going to get the facts at an intel briefing next week. And a staffer told me this morning that the president-elect has no plans to personally reach out to President Putin. However, as we just saw on Twitter, he will publicly reach out to him to praise him. Greg?
Peter, how are Republicans in Congress reacting to the president-elect's response?
Some Republicans are going a lot further than the president-elect, where they are basically praising the Obama White House for doing this, even though they think it took a little too long. And we're hearing from Republicans that they hope the president-elect eventually gets to where they are happy the Kremlin is being punished.
It's okay to say we want to re-engage the Russians and have talks. That's great. But it's another thing entirely to say, hey, they're really our friends. They're really the great protector. That's not the case at all. And I hope some of his words change.
And so far, his words have not changed, but the suggestion from transition officials for the last few days, including on a call this morning, our last call before the holiday, is that they could change. His mind could go in a different direction after he hears what high-ranking intel officials have to say about this issue in the next couple of days in New York. Greg?
Peter Ducey live in Palm Beach. Peter, thanks. Let's bring in Tara Mahler, who is a spokesperson for the Counter-Extremism Project, a former CIA military analyst. Tara, good to see you. What do you make of Vladimir Putin's response here? It appears asymmetric, because historically, the Russians respond in kind to American retaliation.
It is a little asymmetric. It is calculated. And to be honest, it's interesting that he did this, because now he's sort of putting Obama aside and waiting to see for the Trump administration's next move. And as we saw from Trump today with his tweet, he doesn't really seem to be too concerned with the Russians. It will be interesting to see if, after he receives the intelligence briefings, if he can still stick to this line that he doesn't believe that the Russians were involved with the hacking. It seems that everybody in Washington, Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill and across all the intelligence agencies, are in agreement on this, and it seems they've released quite a bit of evidence, other than classified evidence, that the Russians were in fact behind this.
Tara, President Obama had vowed that his response or retaliation would be proportionate to the harm that was caused to America. Yet the expulsion of diplomats is hardly proportional, nor is freezing assets. So do you suspect that there is some covert offensive cyber capabilities that are being undertaken now that might harm Russian computer systems that are highly sensitive?
I think what you saw yesterday was the Obama administration's overt parting shot against Putin with the diplomatic expulsions and the economic sanctions. You're absolutely correct, and this is all speculative at this point, that there might be some covert parting shots that are happening as the administration leaves prior to the Trump administration coming in. Will we know what those are?
Yeah.
Most likely not. Will the Russians necessarily know what those are? Not necessarily. It could be something where we take some information potentially. It could be something where the U.S. footprint is not on it. Again, all speculative. But in President Obama's statement just yesterday, he did make reference to the fact that the sanctions that were issued with the executive order were not the sort of totality of potential retaliatory measures against Putin, leaving the door open to the fact that there might be something covert happening.
If you want the Russians to bear a cost for this, you want them to know your offensive cyber attack. So to that extent, if it is known by the Russians, is that the onset of a dangerous escalation?
There is the potential for escalation. That's why you always need to be careful when you get into this tit-for-tat back and forth, whether it's economic or whether it is on the cyber front. I will say that part of this for the Obama administration is not just about punishing the Russians. Clearly, that's a huge part of why we sanction the Russians and why we might take covert measures. But I will remind you that part of this is deterrence, deterring other actors, whether it be non-state actors, whether it be other countries, whether it be Russia in the future, from carrying out any sort of cyber attack, not just for the purposes of election interference or hacking emails, but cyber attacks in general. So I think the Trump administration, to be perfectly frank, should be in favor of deterring these sorts of attacks. They're going to be in office for the next 4 years. They're going to be the targets of these attacks potentially. What
do you make of Donald Trump's tweet just a short time ago? And I'll read it again. Great move on delay by the Putin. I always knew he was very smart. I mean, look, that's going to strike a great many people as, way too complimentary, if not fawning, toward a known adversary whose interests are inimical to our own.
Yes, I mean, I am all for diplomacy. You need to engage with countries. You need to engage with allies and foes alike. That's how you get to better outcomes in international relations. Having said that, if states are taking aggressive actions towards us, whether that be cyber attacks, whether that be military action, or things that violate our norms on human rights, the United States needs to take action and needs to respond. Otherwise, you're left with a world where we sort of just don't do anything. So I think that Donald Trump, it will be interesting to see when he takes office, if his rhetoric changes. This is not, helping him amongst Republicans on Capitol Hill either, many of whom have been strongly critical of the Trump administration in terms of their posture towards Russia.
Well, he may feel that the whole affair impugns his own legitimacy as the newly elected president. We'll wait and see. Tara Mahler, good to see you. Thank you.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Just ahead, more on those secret Russian compounds, luxury retreats for Russia right here in the U.S. Everything we have learned about them. Welcome back. More on our top story. The Obama administration shutting down 2 Russian compounds right here in the U.S. The State Department set a deadline of noon Eastern time for everyone to leave, and at about 11:30, as you can see, cars and vans started leaving both locations. The retreats in Maryland and New York were officially for diplomats to relax, but Obama administration officials say Russia used them for intelligence operation. Here's the Maryland mansion on Google Earth. It's on 45 acres of land, about 90-minute drive from Washington, D.C. The Soviet government reportedly bought the home back in 1972, according to the New York Times, used it to host parties with caviar and vodka. What else? As recently as 2007, it had 13 fireplaces, according to Washington Life magazine. There was a formal dining room and a living room and a library filled with books. Yuri Ushakov used to serve as Russia's ambassador in the early 2000s, calling the place home for a while, according to the magazine. The New York estate is in Upper Brookville. That's on Long Island, about 45 minutes by car from New York City. Soviets reportedly bought it in the 1950s. David Lee Miller, live in our New York newsroom. David, what else are you learning about the compound here in New York?
Well, Greg, it was bought as a retreat for staffers who work nearby at the UN mission in New York City. Local property records show it is valued at $9.3 million. Annual property taxes are $170,000 a year, but the Russians are tax exempt. The main home was built back in 1918. It sits on just over 14 acres. It has 11 bathrooms. Despite a lot of activity this morning, neighbors say the Russians kept a low profile.
They've lived here quietly, unassumingly for as long as I can remember. I grew up down the street, and our parents told us that this was a diplomatic hub for the Russians. beyond that, I know this was more active during the Cold War, but they've been here for a long time, and there hasn't been too much activity until today.
The Russian retreat being vacated in Maryland was arguably more palatial. The waterfront property, as you mentioned, is on 45 acres. It has a pool, tennis courts, and its own soccer field. There are more than a dozen other smaller buildings on the site, including a hunting lodge decorated with a mural of Russian and American sailors enjoying a toast. There you see it. And speaking about the compounds that are being closed, Russia's UN ambassador accused the Obama administration today of destroying holiday fun for Russian children. Greg?
Wow, what a beautiful place. Good to be a Russian diplomat or a spy. Look, there's another compound. It's in New York, right?
Indeed. The Russians have another large estate not far away from the one we just saw. This one is in Glen Cove, Long Island, and published reports say that it is now virtually empty. It's maintained by a few caretakers. It was built by industrialist George DuPont Pratt and sold to the Russians in the 1950s. That was the height of the Cold War. Then during the 1980s, there were reports the Russians were using this property for electronic surveillance. The local community responded at that time by revoking free beach parking. The Russian government also, Greg, has additional property that diplomats are using for families in the Riverdale section of the Bronx. And there are also Russian consulates throughout the country in Houston, San Francisco, as well as Seattle.
Okay.
Greg?
David Lee Miller. David, thank you. This year in Chicago, criminals have killed more than 700 people and more than 750 murders there in 2016. That, according to the Chicago Tribune's homicide tracker. Yes, there is such a thing. And that is more murders than in New York and Los Angeles put together. That number includes almost a dozen murders just this past Christmas weekend. Senior correspondent Mike Tobin is live in Chicago. Mike, what does Chicago police say they expect for this weekend, you know, when the alcohol really flows?
Well, that's really it, Greg. Cops are anticipating there's going to be an uptick of violence when booze gets poured on top of this never-ending cycle of gang vendettas. As of Thursday, Chicago police reported that some 756 people had been murdered in the city of Chicago compared to 484 last year. 3,525 shootings versus 2,400 last year. An overwhelming number of the victims are black. Most of the shooting targets are documented gang members. The former Chicago police superintendent, Gary McCarthy, who lost his job in the wake of the Laquan McDonald videotape shooting, said the reason for the increase in bloodshed is that policing has become politicized. Cops are hamstrung.
Politicizing of policing is ending up killing more black lives. The number of police-related shootings in this city is less than half of 1% of the shootings in the city of Chicago. So what does that mean? 99.6% of the shootings are civilian on civilian, generally black on black.
Greg, you mentioned the dozen people who were killed over Christmas weekend. 11 of those cases were gangland retaliation. The reason for the timing is because the gang rivals knew they would be home. Greg?
Mike Tobin live in Chicago. Mike, thanks. One of America's allies overseas weighing in on the tension between the U.S. and Russia, comparing it to the Cold War. We'll ask our political panel about that next. And a break in the fighting in Syria. The ceasefire deal between Russia and Turkey apparently. Turkey weighing in on tensions between the United States and Russia after the State Department kicked 35 Russian diplomats out of the country and shut down 2 Russian compounds here in the U.S. The Turkish foreign minister saying it is not good for anybody and they don't want another Cold War era. Of course, Turkey is a key NATO ally of the U.S., but officials there have also been working closely with Russia on a solution to the crisis in Syria. We're going to have more on that in just a moment. In the meantime, we are hearing more from Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Fox Business Network's Blake Berman is live in Washington. Blake, Putin snubbed President Obama in his holiday message?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Greg. The Kremlin released a long list of who Vladimir Putin sent holiday messages to, and they included world leaders of the past, for example, like George H.W. and George W. Bush, current heads of state, just to give you a few names here, Xi Jinping, Angela Merkel, Benjamin Netanyahu. Putin also sent a message to President-elect Donald Trump, but notably absent from the list of roughly 50 top dignitaries or so was President Obama. However, in his statement this morning, Putin did say the following, quoting here. He said, "It is regrettable that the Obama administration is ending its term in this manner. Nevertheless, I offer my New Year's greetings to President Obama and his family." End quote. Not necessarily, though, Greg, the warmest of season's greetings there.
Indeed. Congress, it looks ready to jump into this fray when it returns, right?
Exactly. The new Congress returns next week. January 3rd is the exact date. And Democrats and Republicans are already calling for action. For example, on January 5th, the Senate Armed Services Committee, which is led by John McCain, will hold a hearing regarding foreign cyber threats. Witnesses to that committee include the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. And the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Ben Cardin, is urging Congress to move two potential pieces of legislation forward. One of those would call for additional sanctions against Russia. Greg?
Blake Berman, thank you very much. Let's bring in our panel. Richard Fowler, who is a Democratic strategist, Fox News contributor, and host of the Richard Fowler Show. Noel Nickbour, a Republican strategist, joins us as well. Good to see you both. Richard, let me ask you this. Even some Democrats seem wholly unimpressed with what President Obama has done in the way of punishment or sanctions. Ben Cardin, top Democrat on the Foreign Relations Committee in the U.S. Senate, said these actions are, quote, not sufficient. He is demanding enhanced sanctions. What does it say when at the end of your presidency, even members of your own party are suggesting you're being weak?
Well, here's the thing. I think this president is in a very, very tough situation. One, he has about 20 days left on his presidency. Number two, this whole Russian hacking situation really played into the presidential election, thus making it really hard for the president, saying, should I go earlier and put my thumb on the scale of the election, or should I wait until after? Now, with that being said, relations between the United States and Russia has been quite icy for a while. From the start of when we started talking about NATO expansion a couple of years ago, the Russians and the president have not seen eye to eye. And the third thing I want to say here,
Richard, even more reason not to be weak, timid, and tardy?
Well, I agree with you, and I think the other thing I want to say is that there's some of the things that this White House has done that cannot be announced because it is classified. So we're not really sure what else the White House or the Department of Defense have done in Russia that we do not know about because it's classified. And number two, the Russians would never report it because they have a closed media system.
All right. I want to be fair about this and ask you, Noel, about the reaction from Donald Trump. Consistently has said, well, I don't really believe these allegations. I don't think they're true about Russian hacking. He says we got to move on. Is he not taking this seriously enough?
Well, I think a lot of people think that he, his tweets and what he said about Russia, appears to have a little bit of a bromance, so to speak, with Russia. But one of the things that's going to be very, very interesting, I think, going forward is the fact that President Obama has laid this out. So when Trump takes office, he can do one or two things. He can either say, look, we're going to take these sanctions back, but he can use it as a bargaining tool and say, I will reduce the sanctions if you reduce your military presence in something like the Ukraine. So he could use it as a bargaining chip. Or he could say, well, you know what? What's done is done, and Obama has done the sanctions. And I think that, Democrats, Republicans, and everybody alike agrees that Russia really is not our friend, and they have been hacking. And you can still, Russia already has sanctions anyway. They already have the sanctions from the annexation of Crimea. So the sanctions they already have in place. These are just additional sanctions for cyber hacking.
Richard, I mean, this was, after all, an attack on America's constitutional system. And it was also a threat to our national and economic security. So how is it remotely proportional to kick out a few diplomats and freeze some assets that probably are de minimis?
Well, once again, I think this was an attack. I think all Americans agree, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. It seems the only person that doesn't agree with this or is trying to sort of dance around it is Donald Trump. But beyond that point, like I said earlier, we do not really know what has also happened that is classified in Russia because the Russians don't report it and our government can't tell us about it because of the nature of the intelligence. But I think the further point here, to sort of agree with Noel a little bit, is this ideal that Donald Trump has to walk a really fine line here, because the closer Russia's not our friend, but Donald Trump needs Russia in any type of counterweight to China. So for him to take on the Chinese, take on their bad trade policies, take on currency manipulation, he's going to have to find a way to, one, slap Putin on the hand for violating our election process, and two, work with him to counterbalance the Chinese. So it's a really tough spot for Donald Trump.
Noel, what do you make of Putin's response today? Normally and historically, Russians retaliate in kind. They kick out X number of diplomats after we kick out Y number of diplomats. Didn't do it this time. It's curious, isn't it, that here's Putin trying to portray himself, and maybe he is being, gracious and magnanimous, and characterizing in clear and concise terms that Barack Obama is utterly irrelevant.
Yes, and that's a slap in the face as well by not even making mention. And when you do make mention, sending him a holiday greeting, it's almost like he has the same PR agent as Michelle Obama, which says, when you take the low road, we take the high road. This is very different for Russia to not retaliate by doing the same thing, with dignitaries in Russia. Yeah. But he's not, and he's going a step further to say, they can stay in Russia, and hey, everybody can come, with their children and everybody to the Christmas holiday party. Yeah. So it's a different turn for Russia to have.
Richard Summers saying that this is an attempt by Barack Obama in his waning days to try to, make things difficult for Donald Trump. If so, that's pretty devious and mean-spirited, isn't it?
I don't think so at all. I think this president is committed to a smooth transition. I don't think anybody wants to go to Putin's holiday party.
Well, then why didn't he do it before the election?
Well, the reason why he didn't do it before the election,
he could have done it 10 months ago, 12 months ago.
Well, the reason why he didn't do it is because then folks would argue that he used this as a smokescreen. He used this to help Hillary Clinton. It would become politicized.
How does that correlate?
Because if the president were to go out and say, we know that after the DNC email hack, and be like, we blame this on the Russians and we've shut off all their internet, I think people on the right would be like, this is wrong, he's trying to play victim, blah, 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 blah.
No, he's simply trying to stop the Russians from doing something that's fundamentally wrong in attacking America.
President and the leader of the Democratic Party to sort of put his thumb on the hands of this election. I think everybody can agree with that.
Noel, was President Obama consistently weak in his relationship with Russia and dealing with their various attacks?
Obviously, I think he was. And look, he's doing this on the way out. When it really would have mattered would have been, when he discovered it way back when. But now he's doing it on the way out. It's very bizarre, all the foreign policy he's setting in play as he leaves.
Well, maybe he was overthinking it, and he's been accused of doing that over the course of 8 years. Richard and Noel, good to see you both. Happy New Year.
See you.
All right. The Syrian ceasefire struck by the Russians in Turkey appear to be holding. Now, the deal took effect at midnight. A British human rights group reports there have been a few minor violations. So far, though, no reports of any civilian deaths. Earlier this month, Turkey and Russia brokered a deal for a ceasefire in Aleppo, but all other attempts for a nationwide pause of the fighting have failed. Kitty Logan is following this from our London newsroom. Kitty?
Greg, well, that ceasefire is largely holding so far, but not everyone is convinced that it will do in the long term. Now, there are reports of some minor violations. Since it came into force, there were clashes in several places, including near Idlib. Opposition fighters there say they are respecting the ceasefire, but they're ready to re-engage if it doesn't hold. And in Idlib, too, today, there's still strong opposition to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. There were protests again calling for him to step down. People there are unlikely to accept a Russian and Iranian-backed deal, leaving Assad in power in future. And to complicate matters more, the ceasefire does not include ISIS and al-Qaeda-linked groups. Fighting is continuing in the areas they hold. Now, it was Assad who announced that ceasefire yesterday, but it's Russia who made this deal happen, along with Turkey. And Russia is now asking the UN Security Council to formally adopt a resolution to recognise the deal. And if that ceasefire holds, if it holds, all key players will meet for talks in Kazakhstan in February. But for now, the UN and aid agencies are hoping to use this opportunity to bring in supplies to areas that have previously been cut off by fighting. Greg.
Kitty Logan live in London. Kitty, thank you. Drug traffickers moving marijuana across the United States, but they're not just bringing in the hooch from the south. In fact, more smugglers are turning to Colorado, where cannabis sativa is legal. And they're transporting it to states where it is not. Just ahead, the new weed for weed. And now for our Cheech and Chong segment. People bought more than $1 billion worth of legal pot in Colorado this year. That according to the State Department of Revenue. But what some people did with some of the pot was, well, not legal. The feds say more drug smugglers are getting marijuana from Colorado, and they're moving it across state lines. USA Today reports they're getting pretty creative, putting pot in bags of potato chip, jars of peanut butter, and, well, just sometimes in the mail. Alicia Cunha is live in Denver with more on this. So, Alicia, some drug enforcement officials said keeping legal pot in Colorado would be tough. I mean, I guess that's true, right?
Yes, and the federal drug trafficking authorities who we've talked to here say it's no surprise. And for everyone on Twitter who's been giving me a hard time today about this story, saying, oh, imagine that, there's more to it. Marijuana plants that are grown here in Colorado are taller, wider, and produce far more product with a higher potency than pot from Mexico. The Attorney General of Colorado says states that have recently legalized or are considering it should be warned. Smugglers are setting up shop here.
There are still folks who want it to come and take advantage of the fact that they can grow here. And I don't see that changing anytime in the near future. I think other states are just going to experience what we have, and hopefully they can learn from our experience.
According to the federal Rocky Mountain high-intensity drug trafficking area, the number of seizures of Colorado marijuana heading out of state went from 58 in 2008 to 394 in 2015. And Greg, Colorado's been sued by Nebraska and Oklahoma for this very problem, but the U.S. Supreme Court dismissed the case. Greg?
Are these, all of these states where, you know, the pot is being smuggled in, are they fighting a losing battle?
Well, it really depends on the next administration, right? Take a look at this map. Counting this last election, 8 states plus the District of Columbia now have legal recreational marijuana laws, plus 20 more with legalized medicinal. Legal proponents say the toothpaste is out of the tube.
If anything, what's happening is no different than it was before. People are still using marijuana. It's just that they're more likely to be using marijuana that didn't come from a Mexican drug cartel.
That is true, according to University of San Diego professor David Shirk, an expert on drug trade and border crime, who says legal pot is pushing the cartels out of the marijuana business.
The net result is that Mexican drug cartels are effectively diversifying their portfolios. They're also engaging in other kinds of, unfortunately, more predatory criminal activities, things like kidnapping, extortion, to some extent larceny, stealing petroleum from petroleum lines and so forth.
And as for President-elect Trump, when it comes to legalized marijuana, Greg, he says, in terms of medicinal, he thinks that's okay, but with recreational, nope. Greg, back to you.
All right, Alicia Cunha. Alicia, thanks. 2016 saw instability around the globe, terror attacks and civil war here at home, an historic and bitter presidential election. Fox News was there for all of it. Shepard Smith takes a look back at the year's biggest headlines.
Back up. The year kicked off with an anti-government demonstration. Armed militants took over a federal wildlife refuge in southeastern Oregon. The standoff finally came to an end in mid-February. Marines in Mexico captured the world's most wanted drug lord, El Chapo Guzman, nearly 6 months after the escape from prison. World powers lifted sanctions against Iran after international inspectors announced the country had followed through on the promise to dismantle parts of its nuclear program. President Obama declared a state of emergency over the lead-contaminated water in Flint, Michigan. Nearly a year later, the water is still not safe to drink unfiltered. The conservative Justice Antonin Scalia died in February. President Obama nominated federal Judge Merrick Garland to replace him. But Senate Republicans have refused to schedule his confirmation hearing. The feds got into a legal standoff with Apple after the San Bernardino terror attack. A judge ordered the tech company to unlock the iPhone belonging to one of the killers. The feds later dropped the case, saying they were able to pull data from that phone without Apple's help. In North Carolina, the then governor, Pat McCrory, signed the state's controversial law to limit bathroom options for transgender people. In response, major companies announced their plans to take their business elsewhere. In Baltimore, a judge found police officer Edward Nero not guilty of all charges in the death of Freddie Gray. The case later ended with 0 convictions against officers. The biggest shakeup in recent political history after Donald Trump won enough delegates to clinch the Republican presidential nomination. He later announced Indiana Governor Mike Pence as his running mate. And Hillary Clinton secured the Democratic nomination after an unexpectedly tough challenge from the independent senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders. She later chose the Virginia Senator Tim Kaine as her vice presidential candidate. The worst mass shooting in modern American history happened in 2016 when a gunman opened fire in a gay nightclub in Orlando, killing 49 people. He died after a shootout with police. Britain shocked the world when it voted to leave the European Union. Financial markets around the globe plunged after the decision. The U.S. Defense Secretary Ash Carter lifted the ban on allowing transgender people to serve openly in the U.S. military. NASA's Juno spacecraft flew into Jupiter's orbit on the 4th of July, giving us our best look yet at the largest planet in the solar system. Back here on Earth, the FBI Director James Comey announced his decision not to file criminal charges against Hillary Clinton. But just days before the election, Director Comey said investigators were reviewing thousands of newly discovered emails that could be related to the case. After reviewing the new emails, Comey said he is still not recommending any charges against Hillary Clinton. The year also saw major attacks targeting law enforcement officers in several cities. The deadliest happened in Dallas. A suspect shot to death 5 officers ambush style during a protest against police violence. Officials in Florida announced the first locally transmitted cases of the Zika virus here in the United States. The feds have since warned pregnant women to avoid parts of the Miami area. Nearly 300 people died after a powerful 6.2 magnitude earthquake hit central Italy, bringing down buildings and trapping people under debris. Here in the United States, a series of attacks just hours apart. Investigators say a suspect stabbed 10 people at a mall in St. Cloud, Minnesota. An off-duty cop later shot the suspect and killed him. That same weekend, handmade bombs exploded in areas of New York City and New Jersey, injuring nearly 30 people. Police later arrested that suspect after a shootout. The feds banned the Samsung Galaxy Note 7 cell phone from all U.S. flights after reports the smartphone could overheat and burst into flames. Samsung also announced it would stop selling that phone entirely. A massive hack attack on the internet shut down access to major websites across the nation. The cyber attack targeted a company that manages crucial parts of the web. Donald Trump pulled off perhaps the biggest political upset in history, winning the election to become the country's 45th president. The billionaire and former reality TV star won the Electoral College, but lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton. Fidel Castro died at the age of 90. The dictator ruled Cuba for half a century. President-elect Trump has called on the island country to improve its human rights record, threatening to reverse President Obama's work to normalize relations with Cuba. And the year closed out with a tragedy here at home. Dozens of people died after a fire broke out at a warehouse in Oakland, California, where crowds had gathered for a concert. City officials said they had already been investigating that warehouse for code violations.
And 2016 isn't over yet. Much more ahead on this busy news day, including the search for a small jet that vanished with adults and children on board. And heading into the new year in the dark and the cold, the strong storm. The search is on for a missing plane with children on board. The Cessna vanished from radar last night while flying over Lake Erie near Cleveland not long after takeoff. That according to the Coast Guard. Local media reports say there were 2 families on the small plane, 3 adults and 3 kids. They were apparently heading to Columbus after a Cleveland Cavaliers game. Searchers say the weather was rough overnight, but conditions were better today.
We're taking advantage of all the daylight at this particular time to try and locate any signs of life out there and find the wreckage or find some type of debris or maybe even the aircraft itself just sitting up on the water with 6 people on there.
A Coast Guard spokesperson said searchers have picked up faint hints from an emergency locator beacon, but they haven't found any wreckage or passengers as yet. And a Fox News weather alert now. A nasty winter storm dumping heavy snow, knocking out power in northern New England. And in Maine, more than 100,000 folks woke up without any electricity this morning. Some parts of the state seen more than 2 feet of snow. Dozens of car crashes blamed for the storm, including a deadly wreck that killed a man in Vermont. Chief Meteorologist Rick Reichmuth is live at the Fox Extreme Weather Center, or just Weather Center. Rick?
Hey, Greg. Yeah, the brunt of the storm really targeted Maine, and a lot of people got over 2 feet of snow, and now without power. You don't like to see that when we're approaching January. The temps certainly are chilly out there. This is kind of the tail end of this front. Cooler air is settled in across parts of the south. A really chilly night on tap here as well. But we also have the kind of colder air continuing to pull over the Great Lakes, and because of that, you see all of this lake effect snow that we'll continue to watch throughout the night tonight and throughout part of the day tomorrow. The bulk of that storm, however, is out of here. Just some winds in its wake. This is a future radar. This is what we're going to expect to see over the weekend. We have one storm down across the southwest and a new storm that is going to be brewing here across parts of Texas and throughout the day tomorrow across parts of the deep south. This means for festivities tomorrow night, across parts of the south, we're going to see some problems. That's kind of our one spot, barring, even though across parts of Southern California, maybe in towards Arizona. Big festivities in Times Square tomorrow night. Not that bad at all. Temps into the lower 40s. We'll see some clouds out there, but overall, things looking pretty good, and those temperatures well above average. This is the New Year's Eve forecast around the country. You notice it's a little bit cooler out across the far northern Rockies. That's the cold air that we have in place. Aside from that, we're not looking that bad at all. Midnight forecast tomorrow night. Philadelphia, Boston, New York, all around the 40s. Same goes for Atlanta and D.C. Miami still remaining very, very warm. Go into the day for a few more cities tomorrow night, and Chicago 25. That's where it's going to be certainly a little bit chilly. New Year's Day, the start of the year, not that bad across the east, but you notice this right here, this little cooler air that's moving in, and let me show you what happens. Tomorrow, not that bad really anywhere. Go to Sunday, we start to see a little bit of that pink coming in across northern Montana. This is the trend that we have, Greg, coming up with us. You'll notice Monday and into Tuesday, the next shot of cold air comes in, and we are all probably going to be dealing with that by the time we get to the latter part of next week.
Yikes. Time to stay in bed.
Yeah.
Rick Reichmuth. Rick, thanks. We'll be back in a moment with the rise and fall of a former superpower. And finally, on this day in 1922, the USSR was born. Vladimir Lenin had led the Bolshevik forces during the Russian Revolution. He became the first head of the Soviet Union. He died about a year later. It eventually included 15 republics and became a superpower facing off against the United States during the Cold War. But by 1991, all but one republic, Georgia, had broken away. The USSR officially came to an end after the birth of a revolutionary nation 94 years ago today. I'm Greg Jarrett. Thanks for watching.